afternoon, and welcome to Fintech South 2020. This is the Lessons from the Front Line, Fighting Fraud and Cybercrime. And with me today, I have Russ Ayres, Barry Hensley, Carolyn DeVar, and Tim Callahan. So quickly, let's do a quick round of introductions of everyone, and we'll move into the panel discussion. Russ?
Hi there, Russ Ayres from Equifax. I'm the Deputy CISO. I also head up architecture, engineering, and operations for our security tooling.
All right, thanks for joining. Barry?
Hey, I'm Barry Hensley. I'm actually the Chief Threat Intelligence Officer for Secureworks. I'm responsible for our security research group and our incident response teams.
Thanks. Carolyn?
Carolyn DeVar from JPMorgan. I'm the head of our commercial banking, identity and access management, data management, privacy, and protection team.
Perfect, thanks. Tim?
Yeah, I'm Tim Callahan. I'm the global CISO at Aflac, and I'm responsible for, traditional information security, information governance, disaster recovery, business continuity, business resiliency program, as well as cybercrime prevention. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks. Great to have everyone. My name is Kevin Simmonds. I'm a partner at PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and our cybersecurity, privacy, and forensic practice. So what we have today is, again, a conversation around fighting fraud and cybercrime when you think about it from the front lines. We have a great list of panelists who provide perspectives from what they've seen and what they're dealing with their organizations. We would like to take any questions that will come from the audience as you hear the responses. If it works out, we'll weave them into the conversation, and we'll definitely try and make time at the end to answer any questions. So with that, Russ, the first question to you. So COVID-19 has caused everyone to adjust in various ways since March. When you reflect on all the recent operational and technology changes that most organizations are dealing with, how has that influenced or impacted your approach to defending against cybercrime and fraud?
Yeah, great question, Kevin. And certainly it's made an impact across the entire organization, a lot of different ways. If I reflect back and think of the major areas that it impacted, I'd say it's along a few fronts, maybe three of those predominantly. Capacity has been affected. You got to look at what is the distribution of people's attack surface into the organization. So that's the second thing that's been impacted. And then the final thing that's been impacted is just the user experience. I'll take each one of those in turn. You have a capacity problem in that most of the VPN connections that you had initially were expecting that people were in the office for a certain period of time, and then they went home every now and then and connected in sporadically over the course of the day. And what we saw almost instantly is that pattern shifted. So maybe the capacity that you had in your office locations or in the data centers where you were funneling traffic through, that didn't support all of the people going home immediately that afternoon or over the course of the next couple of weeks. The next thing that you saw is kind of a broadening and a loiter time longer than what you would have expected people to stay on, for example, on VPN, because maybe part of your restrictions were keep people on for a certain number of hours and then re-up them and go back through MFA. That expectation shifts when you're expecting them to stay on the machine that they're at their home office with the entire day. And very strange things came out of that. You're re-upping maybe the MFAs in the middle of somebody's workday, which might not have occurred before because people are normally logging into those off cycle or off hours or something like that. And where that gets us to is the last part, which is actually the way that people are experiencing it, the expectations that they have for always on, and maybe you have to change up your entire dynamic of how you're inspecting that traffic. Are you going to split tunnel that stuff out from the endpoint back out through an internet channel for them that's more stable, more reliable than it is to long haul that and bring it all the way back to VPN Central, wherever you've got that? So I think it changes almost every aspect from that experience of the end user. What is it like to be connected to your network, through to the people that are connected through the security of that network. So how do I protect the people that are connected? Because now you've switched it from these central hubs out to everybody is connected to almost everything at the same time, all the way through to just the mechanics of your capacity placement, because you probably didn't buy a whole lot of devices right before COVID to handle all this extra VPN traffic. So I'd say it encompassed just about every facet of not only the way we protect, but also the experience people have into our networks.
Definitely. Fair points. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, a lot of what we saw very early on was some of the simple things like, how do you print? It was amazing. People who hadn't printed in 6 months all of a sudden wanted to print from home on their own device at home. And they couldn't understand why we didn't want them to have that. We didn't know what their connection was. We didn't know who else was using that. Another thing that we looked at was also, who are you co-located with? So now you have your employee and you have your workforce working remotely. Do they have competitors sitting there? So not only how are you protecting the data that's being transmitted through your networks, but how are you protecting the verbal and the communications that are happening? So there was a lot around those pieces. And then our friends like Alexa, Google Home, Siri, reminding people that they are listening, like what devices are sitting around them. You would be surprised on how many calls that you would be on, and all of a sudden you would hear them chime in. So those are some of the other things. It was like the environment that you were in. The last thing that we saw a lot of being in the financial services is the PPE. We had many of our clients trying to get, this protective equipment really quickly, and it was trying to protect them. I mean, the FBI alone saw an increase of 250% of reported incidents on fraud, $15 million in the first months. That was just related to PPE. You also had so many people wanting to click on trackers. Everybody wanted the tracker. They wanted to know what was the case rate, what was the bed rate, like how close was it coming to where they lived and they resided. Little did they know, so many of those trackers, what was it installing on their computer? Where was that malware coming from? Because free is not always free.
Yeah. All very good points. Anyone else?
Yeah, we were very well equipped from a technology standpoint to get our employees home and working and stood up, because we had really embraced that concept of work from anywhere. What we probably did not pay as much attention to is, before we started, we had maybe 10% of employees working remote. We went to 98%. And just the experience and the education and the things that Carolyn pointed out, those kind of just user awareness things. So we had to really spin up quickly to address and educate on those kind of things. We certainly have the technological security, the system security, those kinds of things covered. But user behavior is different in that environment, and so we had to kind of quickly fashion a whole awareness campaign around that, and then just in people that have never used WebEx before or that type technology, and educating them on that. Those are the kinds of things that it's very difficult to anticipate and plan for.
Hey, Tim, I just got to say the fact, and I know you guys got a phenomenal security program, but what's been interesting when I hear people say that they were very prepared for this remote transition that we went to, and I congratulate you and your team. What's interesting is how many organizations don't necessarily understand how their third parties that support them were prepared for this transition. And so you may not have increased your risk, but are your third parties that now support you, what do we know about their risk, and how do you validate some of the decisions they made?
I think you're right, Barry. And that did catch us, in our contracts, in financial institutions, generally you don't permit, especially offshore providers, to work from home. That's, you're relying on contractual controls, physical and environmental controls, and having, kind of step through that process. Our contracts did not permit it, but they were mandated to, and so we had to figure out how we're going to pivot, permit, and then protect. And again, we're very fortunate because we use all of our providers come in through a VDI environment, so we can kind of control the data and the views and those kinds of things. But as was pointed out earlier, I think Carolyn said it. We don't know who's over their shoulder. And that puts us in a different dynamic.
Yeah, and a lot of them had latency issues in some of our
Yeah.
non-US locations. They were trying to use their phone's hotspot to dial in, and it was amazing from a productivity in those early days. So you saw a lot of the US counterparts really lifting up and staying the longer hours so that we wouldn't lose the productivity and we could still serve our client. But it was like, trying to keep the employee morale up at the same time when they're trying, and they're borrowing the laptop from their neighbor who uses it for the first 8 hours of the day, and then they're using it for the other 8 hours. Then you also have to think about, like, do you allow, like, they're now on a device and they're, with the VPN in, something as simple as copy and paste. Like, where is that data being stored? Where are they downloading that data? How are you protecting the data that's now sitting on a device that you don't own, that you don't monitor? And a lot of people were like, well, it's on a VPN. I'm like, but where is that third party allowing you to download that? Those were some of the early things that we made sure that it wasn't being downloaded, that we had those trust lists in place.
All very good and important points. What I'm hearing is definitely the endpoints and protecting the endpoints became a heightened element of consideration as we moved into the COVID-19 days of working remotely. Remote access. How are we providing it and what is it exposing? Because we're still trying to continue to operate the business as effective as possible, but understanding what is the risk associated with that remote access, which also I think ties into visibility. How is the visibility of your environment and the attack coming from the new routes in to critical parts of the environment is important. And then to your point, Carolyn, the environment, like the environment that the workers are working in. Is it their home network? Is it pick your coffee shop? Is it someone who is not sitting behind a router, which means that now your endpoint, which is connected into the environment, is now exposed to the internet? There are so many different variables and elements that have to be considered as we think about how do we continue to operate effectively as an organization, but ensure that we still provide the appropriate security wrappers around the way that we operate. And those type of adjustments is what I've been hearing as well. So great to hear that everyone's already thinking about that, and if anything, part of the conversation, right, to share some thoughts around what we're seeing and doing as security professionals to ensure that we support our organization. Great. Okay. Well, next question goes to you, Barry. So I've heard a mix of responses over the last couple of months, but would you say that your initial prioritization of cyber and fraud initiatives has either remained the same, slightly adjusted, or just completely changed just because of where you were prioritizing and thinking and building out programs in 2019 versus what the world has brought us in 2020?
Yeah, Kevin, if you'll give me the latitude, I'm actually going to answer that question in two folds. One is talking about our 4,000 clients across 53 countries and what we've seen in their own evolution tied to COVID-19. And I would say from their perspective, many of those organizations, of which 49% of our customer base is in the financial space, a lot of organizations use this as an opportunity to transform themselves, meaning that they're actually leaning way forward to say, this is the new norm. And because of that, they're doing somewhat digital transformation. Now at the same time, going from, back to Tim's comment, earlier that you flip from 80% on site to all of a sudden now 80% remote. And that rapid change of that flip, all of a sudden, so many organizations took some risk as part of that quick pivot. And based upon that, I think some of the things that have changed has been, how do you now validate the potential vulnerabilities that you've exposed based upon those changes? How have you went back and documented the changes you made in your environment, whether it be even IT network changes or overall configuration change? The other interesting one, I think that back to your comment about the endpoint, the traditional perimeter in many cases has eroded, and some cases disappeared. And because of that, many organizations are now reprioritize a zero trust model. How do you fast forward to a world where you're more focused on the securing the data versus securing the traditional, security controls? And in line with that, we've seen a lot of people look at simplifying their authentication models without increasing risk. So many organizations have said as part of their transformation, they're going to leverage, I hate this term, more of the cloud, meaning they're going to use Office 365 or AWS in a very unique way. And also, I think from a prioritization perspective, I do believe that many organizations, we've seen this part of, I think we've doubled the number of incident response engagements year to date, which means we're only 8 months into the year, and we've already done almost twice as amount as we did for the entire year last year. Where last year, 10% of those were insider threat related. Today, they're about 18% of them. And so I do believe, based upon the social and economic disruption of so many people's lives, that now all of a sudden there's an additional threat from an insider perspective, especially as we're starting to see more workforce reductions across so many different organizations. So I think by the nature of the beast, if you surveyed our entire client base, I think they would say that they have adjusted that. But at the same time, I think some organizations like Tim, and most likely the others, my peers on the call, they probably were a little more prepared. And I'd be interested to hear from them just how much this crisis or change caused them to change their priorities.
Yeah, I think I'll address a couple of things there. One of them is the devaluation of the data has been a focus of ours for a little while now. Not thinking that it was going to be COVID related, of course, but more to the outcomes that you were describing. We knew that the perimeter was getting extended in ways, third parties or the rest, not necessarily related to the insider threat portion that you mentioned, which we would also see across this entire spectrum. So I think there's an interesting takeaway from that, Barry, and that is that defense in depth that we all talk about. We've been going through being prepared for something that's going to change, no plan, last through that first contact with the enemy, right? The situation we've gone through recently just kind of affirms or confirms the method that we've been talking about. And that is, maybe it's not a great idea to put cameras, locks, everything on every single window if you don't have all of your valuables protected in a safe in the basement, or however you determine to protect your valuables. So from our perspective, getting a hold of that data as soon as it comes in and trying to devalue it in some way that's useless to the attacker, even if they caught it right after ingestion, that's really been a focal point for us. And this has just confirmed that and like triple-sided it for us that was the right idea, and we need to continue doing it.
I thought it was an interesting point too, Barry made on, kind of the insider threat. I mean, certainly that was something that, occurred to us early because, again, being offsite, the opportunities there in some respects. But what I've found very interesting in looking at some of the industry reports, data breach reports, those kinds of things, is that in the insider threat, there's actually been an increase in not malicious, but unintentional kind of leakage. And that, again, that's a different perspective. It's a different parameter. And what becomes really important is the traditional program change type controls, the traditional IT controls around, promotion to production, around, change management and those kinds of things. When the data leaks, the damage is done, and whether it's malicious or whether it was innocent, the consequences are generally, pretty much the same to the company. I mean, once it's exposed, we have to declare, we have to take care of. So we've been really, kind of shifting a little more thought to what are some of those proactive measures that we can make sure our controls are operating in this decentralized environment, because it's not just, the normal employee that has gone remote. All of our IT employees are working remote too. So, how do those work?
A lot of what we've seen from our clients is just that they needed to change what they thought a business resiliency plan was. It wasn't just like, if you lose a site, now if you completely lose your infrastructure. Let's think about, the benefits of things like Office 365, AWS, but what about happens when those are outages? Like, how are you resilient? How do you continue operating? It's not like you can go to pen to paper because you're all co-located. It's a very different experience. And then how do you onboard a new user? While some industries are losing people, some are having to hire. Like, look what happened with the payment protection plan. If you look at banks in general, they had to bring many more people on very quickly. Now you're bringing those people on. How do you validate who they are? Are you going to give them the high value business entitlement? No, you're probably going to have to shift the workforce and really teach that new workforce, like the basic elements. How do you make sure that that's happening? Those were some of the things we saw, but then also for our clients, it was the best practices. So we're constantly instilling that idea of like call back, like to your point with that unintentional, threat actor. So like business email compromise, someone is asking you to do something. Well, what's the callback? No one's in the office. Not everyone has call forwarding. Are you calling someone's cell phone? How do you know it's really them? Some of those things, it's led our clients to really have to come up with those, business impact analysis. Which one of those systems are really critical? What are those processes? How do we add additional thresholds? So almost complicating the process to protect them.
Yeah, all very, very good points, and totally agree. One of the things that we're seeing as well at PwC is an increased discussion around resiliency. So you're spot on there. How do you consider it from a cyber standpoint? And how do you consider it from even those third parties that are supporting operations? And if something starts to break down, how do you ensure you're still being able to operate operations from an IT standpoint, as well as from a security standpoint?
Well, and if you look at the regulations that have been coming in, right, like that third party is even more regulated now. And the way we have to protect some of that data with the inclusion of like CCPA this year, so the California Consumer Privacy Act. There's a lot more that we as companies are on the hook for, even though we're maybe the primary who's operating against that data.
Fair points. Anyone else? All right. Well, Carolyn, I'll stick with you on this one. So when you think about ISACs or information sharing and analysis centers, it's a reminder of the potential benefit of sharing information to quickly respond and defend against attacks. So with that philosophy in mind, how can others combine the capabilities of cyber and fraud to better defend and protect an organization? Almost that convergence component.
Yeah, so we're a big proponent of the ISOCs. We participate in them at all points in time, but we also participate with partner banks. Because at the end of the day, if you look at the financial services industry as a whole, you're not normally operating with just one bank. And banks are normally partners in a lot of the ways that we do our deals. The FS ISOCs can give us the ability to really see some of those trends very early on. But it's not only the ISOCs. We partner very closely with government, with FBI, with, depending on where your jurisdiction is. Because at the end of the day, we all need to work together to stay one step ahead of those who are really trying to do harm and trying to get the data that we have. One of the things that we developed a couple of years ago is something called Protect the Client. And we really we saw through a lot of our AFP surveys that a lot of our fraud issues were really cyber issues. Someone clicked a link, someone's email was spoofed, a computer was compromised, someone was watching and screen scraping and key logging, trying to get those credentials. And ironically, last year for the first time, we saw a decrease in the amount of impacts that came from business email compromise, because it was that constant education or awareness. It's that continuous learning. It's not that you can just take a course once a year. So the same thing goes for all of us as security professionals. We need to constantly learn and adapt to the changes that are coming to us to figure out, are our defenses really the best defenses that we can put in place to protect our clients?
Yeah, good points. It's one thing that I don't know how many people are saying it's depending on their organization and the different disciplines within, but making that connection, because there's times where we've had conversations with clients, which is, if you think about some of the fraud that we hear and read about, there's typically a traditional cyber and IT related element to it for them to eventually get to the end of that continuum and perpetrate the fraud, whether it's jackpotting, whether it's being able to make adjustments within a financial system that is transferring money. There's still a traditional element of how did the threat actor make their way into the environment to then take advantage of maybe missing or fraud controls that are not as mature as they should be to protect the organization from someone perpetrating that. Somewhat connecting the statement that I just made and the question that came in. But when would an organization say that maybe it's time for me to invest in a fraud solution, given that I'm seeing an increase within our organization? I don't know, Carolyn, you have something that comes to mind when you hear that one, but
well, when I hear fraud solution, it comes down to some of the basic controls and the behaviors. At the end of the day, and we say this a lot of times to our client, you took the action. You can put as many controls in place and you can put as many filters and checkboxes into our systems. You can put thresholds, you can put additional approvals. But if the person who's clicking that box isn't paying attention to what they're doing and they're not following those controls, it's really hard to have IT always be the hook. One of the things we always say with our clients is, as a cyber professional, as a technology professional, we'll build you the mechanisms, we'll build you the controls. Whether or not you choose to use them and follow them is really up to the individual. It's helping that business or that front line really connect the dots to how they are just as part of the solution as the rest of us. I mean, software is only as good as the user who implements it.
Yeah, Carolyn, I have to pull that thread just to give an example. Organization went to great lengths to implement multi-factor authentication across their entire remote workforce. What they didn't necessarily think about was the multi-factor authentication solution still required that when you set up and log into MS Teams, it's going to send you a push notification to your authentication, app that sits on your phone. Well, what if an adversary actually attempts to log in, the push notification happens, you don't pay attention, and you hit accept on your phone, thinking that's some background app that's running. And the adversary just compromised your multi-factor authentication because you went to great lengths to set it up, but it was the last mile of the human decision point that they still have to pay attention to. And that's a great point. I mean, you can put all the protection in place, but if the human element's not necessarily embraced, the security, part of that journey,
Well, and then
you
we
just have
saw
the same
some
issue.
clients comment where they'd rather have, like, for example, RSA. RSA is one of the multi-factor tokens that's available to users. And they, as clients, wanted to have the token because the device was owned by the user. And it was for them, when somebody left, if they took that token, it for them was almost a sense of security that they've removed the user. My comment back is, did you actually delete the user? Did you actually take the access away? Because that token is one part of the element. If they really want to get in, they'll find a way.
Yeah, but good points. It's funny, there was an exercise that we were doing with a client where, from a multi-factor authentication standpoint, it was the education, it was the technology. They had it in place, but we were discussing whether or not, when the end user receives the request to accept it, do they know what they're accepting it for? Is there any additional details you can provide on that MFA request to say that, except for logging into VDI or Citrix, so that when they connect what they're saying and they're about to accept, it aligns with what they would be doing at the time? And then how do you tie that into the security awareness to understand what is provided to you so that as the end user, you are a part of that security chain to further support, protect an organization, given that all these investments are made in technology, it still ends with that last piece for the most part from a human element standpoint. All right. Well, I'm going to hit one more question to the group and then see if we can open up for more questions from the audience. So, Tim, we'll turn this one to you. So, when you think about it, where should organizations focus their efforts when you start looking at 2021 as we continue down this journey of really enabling the business to grow with security first in mind, or with those services being tied into it?
Yeah, so one of the things that we found necessary was to accelerate our digital transformation initiatives. Our business was very focused on human interaction. Our independent sales agents meeting with employees, meeting of client companies, or meeting with individuals in a small business type setting. And, we had on our product path, some e-commerce type solutions in the works. And so what we did is we started accelerating them. So we pivoted from some of our other initiatives to really concentrate on that. And it was a little bit fortunate. My team, our client authentication, cybercrime prevention group, had anticipated this digital transformation. So we had implemented and began to implement a common client authentication, identification, an authorization solution, so that once we enroll a new client, we go through all the validations, the verifications, and then we manage that through the life cycle of that client, of that customer. And so what we we were able to do is help our IT partners and our e-commerce partners in accelerating that initiative. And we've done it in a way that now that we have the platform, each line of business can take advantage of that same authentication platform. And we're not trying to catch up. I remember early days in banking, it's almost like we invented internet banking, and then we just discovered, oh my God, we got to secure this stuff, and what we didn't want that to happen again. And so we took those early steps.
Hey, Tim, one thing jumps out to me when we're talking about 2021. You mentioned you were, ready for getting things out remote. So this kind of struck me as a surprise, maybe not for everybody who's been on your journey already and ready for everybody to be working from home, but we're seeing people work longer hours than they traditionally would because they're not stuck in traffic anymore. So that's great because they're more productive. And one of the things that has been coming up is a lot of those virtual happy hours are starting to come back. People tapping people on the shoulder saying, listen, I just need to disconnect from work for a second, but I still want the relationships that I had before, and it got disconnected for me. So in 2021, one of the things that we've been talking about is setting up some time where we stress to our employees, please stop working. I couldn't help but notice, I'm online all the time anyway. So if I see you on and you're on the same amount as me, I probably need to push you off. Any of those things that I should be considering like for 2021 to pay attention to, since you're a little bit more heads forward on getting everybody remote?
One of the things when I was in the military, I was in bomb disposal. So one of the things that we always tried to protect against was complacency, or just becoming so comfortable in your environment you begin to make mistakes without thinking, right? Or fatigue. And I do think there's a bit of pandemic fatigue setting in, not only in our workers, but kind of in society. I mean, people are just, they're tired of it, right? And so we've done a lot of things in that area, as with my team, but more broadly across the company. And in some cases, we're having a lot more kind of town halls, virtual town halls. We're having more interactive times. We have at least monthly an employee-hosted kind of break room, virtual break room, where people just they come in and they talk like they would if they were on-prem, and And I will tell you, I have great admiration for all the meeting companies. They've really stood up to it, whether it's Zoom, WebEx, whatever. And I don't have any partiality. I think they've all stood up to the task to make these things more experiential than just hopping on and having a camera. And, having the ability to go into chat rooms and these side conversations as well, especially with some of the conferencing solutions. And I will tell you, I've upped my one-on-one times, my skip level meetings, those kinds of things. And in many ways, it's almost ironic that I've become closer to some of the team, because now I'm in their living room kind of thing, or they're in mine. And but I think, Russ, to that point, it's very important. A leader always has to care first for their employees, right? And care first for their team and serve their team. But now is essential if we're going to fight kind of the boredom, the complacency, and the fatigue.
Yeah, one of the things I'm very proud of JPMorgan is that we didn't stop anything. Our trainings, which were in person, now became virtual because of those very tools. We were able to still have breakout rooms. We have, hackathons, multiple hackathons a year. We continued all the hackathons. It was very interesting to see that. Now, the energy of the room was slightly different, but, we also had our T-shirts. We had all those different types of things. We just found a new way to do it. And then for those of us, like I have international teams, so for me, it wasn't any difference. I'm used to being on the phone with my teams. But for those people who are, in locations where they collaborate with the whiteboards, the new whiteboarding tool that we have. I mean, we have the ability to share our screens, but, they'd be able to dribble. And, the happy hours. The happy hours were fun. I think all of us probably have had an animal or two, probably show up to those. but you saw the authentic self coming out. And that's something we had been working on for quite a while, was bring your authentic self, bring your whole self to work, bring that entire creativity, because it brings that psychological safety, that trust, which we really need right now. And to your point, Tim, on leadership, our leaders were showing that. Sometimes I'm convinced maybe they had their child come on purpose, but it was showing they were all going through this together.
I think that's so funny. You know, one of my first town halls, I've got two dogs, a Yorkshire Terrier and a Irish Doodle. The Irish Doodle's huge, you know, the Yorkshire is small. And I'm sitting there talking to my team, and all of a sudden two little ears perk up, you know, just in the camera. And you know, the Yorkshire just hopped in my lap, you know. But I think in that moment it struck me, hey, I'm as vulnerable, you know, to my team as ever in this. And I've always tried to you know, build that relationship with my team, but that just cemented it. And everybody started in the chat, you know, whose ears, you know, what, show us the dog, you know. And I had to show them. Of course, Teddy, the big one, comes over at about that time, because anytime I pay attention to one, the other one's going to be there. But it's just real at that point. And I think that's something that we've captured in this. I hope we never lose as we start to go back in on-prem. So
I agree, because the healthy debates have started where people are now, they're going to push a little harder against each other to really innovate. And the last hackathon, the amazing things that I saw come out of it with the same team, I've participated multiple times, and they were pushing each other in different ways, very positive pushing. And what we were able to come up with and develop, it was just amazing. It just shows what's really possible.
Russ, any or Barry, any last thoughts before we bring this to a close?
Yeah, those are all great. I mean, for me, you know, I like the view of 2021 a little better than I did in the March timeframe of 2020. I think we've got more experience, and I hope we do exactly as Tim described. I hope we don't lose the positive stuff. I hope we get rid of the bad stuff. I do believe our orientation towards being more flexible, giving people that space, right? Understanding that Tim's going to have a dog in his shot. Yeah, because he has dogs. That's his life. You know, we should be okay with that. I hope that makes me be a little less pretentious if I was being that way before about what somebody had in their own personal space. Hopefully I wasn't, but if I was, I hope I stop it. And in 2021, I hope I'm a lot more understanding of those situations that cause the flexibility in the first place so that we can benefit from the flex.
I saw Barry's, I think it was a black lab earlier.
Yeah, right.
But you know, we saw Barry's dog. So
yeah, all three of them actually. And so, hey, Kevin, if you don't mind, as we close, I want to take that 2021 question a different direction just for a second. And that's the fact that while we're changing and evolving, so are the adversaries. And so what we have been seeing as an example, many organizations have done a phenomenal job in building disaster recovery plans based upon the potential of ransomware as an example. Meaning I'm not going to pay the ransom. So because I've done just a great job to be able to bring my network back alive. But I will tell you, the counter, the chess move that we're in, all of a sudden we're seeing new ransomware campaigns, what we call name and shame, where the adversary is now, you know, stealing data and ransoming off the data as an additional degree of incentive for you to pay their ransom. Meaning not only do they encrypt your systems, they're also inspiring you to pay their ransom because they have some critical data. And so, you know, we spend a lot of time, you know, Carolyn, to your point, doing hackathons, but as much of our hackathons are thinking about how do we think about the next chess move of the adversary.
We do tabletops. We do, you know, red teams. We have someone try and break in, and we simulate with our executive staff. Now, it's funny how many people are like, well, why would I be part of a tabletop, this resiliency exercise? I'm like, it's not a tech exercise. Tech will drive it and plan it many times, but it's the business. Who's your incident responder? Yeah. And who's going to make that decision? Are you even going to pay?
Yeah.
And then how can you pay? Do you have the cryptocurrency? Because most people aren't going to ask JPMorgan for a wire.
Yeah.
It's funny. We just see a lot of people that are building their response plan based upon the last incident, not necessarily thinking about what the next will be.
They're not doing that BIA, that business assessment, right? They're not looking at like what critical systems really are the critical systems. It's not everything. So I know, Kevin, you were trying to jump in.
Sorry, it's a great conversation. Sorry to cut us a little short, but Russ, Barry, Carolyn, Tim, many thanks for your inputs and thoughts, perspectives. It's been a great conversation. Again, great time, great conversations, and I look forward to a new world in 2021, given all the insights that we've had from this conversation. Have a good rest of your day, everyone.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, and thanks for being a great host.
Thanks.
Thanks.